Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in Linguistics. We are today going to discuss the contents of the last module of this course, Introduction to Phonetics and Phonology. It's a kind of epilogue to the entire course. It's time that we took a stock of the course, the various modules that we have studied before we go on to the next module on phonology, advanced phonology. We began with talking about phonetics. That covered half of the course material, and then we turned to phonology. The division was almost equal. The phonetics modules mainly focus on three areas of phonetics. So the entire course is divided into two parts: modules dealing with phonetics and modules dealing with phonology. The division is almost equal. In phonetics, we began with talking about two different approaches to the study of speech sounds. As things stand now, we talked about the physicalist and the mentalist approaches to the study of speech sounds. Now, the basic difference between them, as we pointed out, was that the physicalist approach considers phonetics and phonology to be closely related to each other, whereas the mentalist approach considers phonology to be separate from phonetics. It's possible to study the two disciplines from these two different perspectives. In this course, however, we provide the basic elementary knowledge that goes with phonetics and phonology. Within the course that we are covering here, the difference between the physicalist and mentalist approaches does not arise. It's only beyond this point, when we go to do advanced phonology or we go to do advanced phonetics, that we may choose one or the other approach. In phonetics, our main concern was the description and use of the International Phonetic Alphabet. The entire phonetics material is geared toward gaining competence, efficiency in the use of the IPA. Actually, the purpose of this whole course is served if you, the students, are able to have the efficiency in using IPA to transcribe speech sounds in your languages or in any world languages. Besides, you should be able to read different symbols used for the variety of sounds used in world languages. So that's the focus. Now, we started with presenting the IPA. On the screen, you notice that we have the various parts of the IPA. We have the first chart of pulmonic consonants, as you can see, and then we have another chart. So in addition to the pulmonic consonants, we also have non-pulmonic consonants, which give us three different types of sounds, namely clicks, implosives, and ejectives. These are the two main consonant charts. We also have vowel charts, which we gave, where mainly the cardinal vowels are shown on the vowel chart, and we learned how to label these vowels and how to describe sounds in different languages in relation to these. In addition to the segmental sounds, vowels and consonants, we also have suprasegmentals, namely stress, tone, and intonation. So you take a look at the screen and see what symbols are used. We have to keep checking throughout this course whether we are able to use these various symbols to talk about different aspects of speech sounds. Then, after these in the end, we have these diacritic marks. These are extremely useful. After we have learned to transcribe different symbols for different sounds, we find that because of the limitations of having a small number of syllables compared to a large number of speech sounds in world languages, it's virtually impossible to include symbols for all of them. So the method, the parsimonious method that is being used here is to use the diacritics so that you can show that the given sound is related to another given sound. You should be able to study the difference amongst these diacritics very minutely. For example, you have the symbol for voiceless, which is a small circle, and then you have these two dots for breathy voiced. Similarly, you will have the symbol for raising a sound or for fronting a sound compared to backing a sound, etc. Now you should be able to pay close attention to these and develop efficiency in the use of these. In order to be able to do phonetics, we divided it into these three conventional branches, namely articulatory phonetics and acoustic phonetics and auditory phonetics. Auditory phonetics, we tried to show, is somewhat very rich, but the work in auditory phonetics takes us more towards natural science, and not much work has yet been done in that field that can be taught to the students in the classroom. Essentially then, articulatory phonetics and acoustic phonetic descriptions are crucial to the study of speech sounds as of now. We do use auditory phonetic terms sometimes like loud or long and short, etc., but that is it's mainly restricted to the use of these auditory sounds. Remember that we use the terms in acoustics and articulatory phonetics somewhat technically. The auditory phonetic terms are not so technically used, but they are sort of used side by side with these technical terms. Now, when we do look at the articulatory phonetics, we try to see how speech sounds are articulated, and basically we saw that there are three main types of speech processes. The sources of speech, namely lungs and glottis and velum, which give us the different types of speech sounds. And based on the study of the articulatory process of the various consonants and vowels, we are now able to find the reasoning behind the grouping of consonants and vowels into their various subgroups. Once the articulatory phonetic study was over in terms of those first 9 modules, then we turned to acoustic phonetics, where we tried to relate what we studied in articulatory phonetics to acoustic phonetics. We tried to see how speech sounds actually are manifested in the air, what kinds of properties go with these sounds, how they can be related to the articulatory properties of speech sounds. We have today fairly useful software to study speech sounds in terms of their acoustic properties. For example, Praat and Wave Surfer and so many others. The one which comes very handy for us is Praat. Now on the screen you will see at least there are 2 different pictures of the acoustic properties of speech sounds. These are divided into 2 types. You will see there's an oscillogram and there's a spectrogram. So the oscillogram gives us the intensity of the sound. Spectrogram gives us the various formants that are used, and together we use them to look into the properties of speech sounds. In acoustic phonetics, we also try to see how the transitions from one sound to another take place, and how is it that the human ear is able to distinguish between them, even though they are so closely together. Once the study of phonetics was over, we turned to phonology. In the early days, it was known as phonemics. Structural phonology, which laid the grounds for phonology, gave us some of these basic equipment, we can say, for describing speech sounds, for studying speech sounds. We saw how phonology comes to use different types of notation, brackets, for example, square brackets and slanted lines, and so on, as you see them on the screen. And then, in addition to these notations, we were also introduced to how different types of statements are made in phonology. We began with learning to make informal statements, and then to turn them into formal statements. As we learn more and more about phonology, from the earliest stage of looking at the distribution of sounds to try and relate these sounds as one coming from the other, and then finally we learn about the distinctive features. We have different versions of the formal statement of sounds. This is something that we paid attention to from the start, so that you are able to choose from amongst these in your own descriptions of speech sounds. Remember that the various informal and formal statements of processes and rules in phonology follows actually the procedure for analyzing phonemes of English. Basically, the method is to be able to see speech sound in relation to each other in terms of either contrast or togetherness. And these two relations give us phonemes and allophones of the languages. It's mainly in connection with the allophones that we need for these the statements of rules, processes as to how one phoneme changes to an allophone, etc., or how a speech sound changes to another speech sound. When our interest in the description of phonological processes grows, then we find that there are multiple types of phonological processes. We discussed them here in great detail. It's very difficult to find the discussion of these at one place in a book, so please pay close attention to them. Essentially, we divided the discussion of phonological processes into two types. We call them whole segment phonological processes. These are processes like insertion, deletion, syllabication, etc., as you see them on the screen. Then the second one is the modification type of phonological processes. These involve the change of a phoneme into an allophone, or one allophone into another allophone. Now, the various types of processes have their own phonetic notation used, and that's the purpose of this, to be able to see what are all the possible types of processes and how to state them. Once we had a fairly good introduction to phonemic analysis and the various types of phonological processes, we then turned to some of the problems in phonemic analysis that are faced. It's not the case that the phonemic analysis, the principles, are so foolproof that they can never go wrong, or that they can help you to arrive at definite conclusions. they also have problems like language has problems. And these problems were discussed in terms of these various topics that you see on the screen. Insufficiency of the notion of phonetic substance, for example. What is exactly the phonetic substance? It's very difficult to talk about it. When we say two sounds are related to each other, phonetically similar to each other, what do we mean by phonetic similarity? It's not so well defined. Then notion of what is significant contrast. The notion of monosystematicity. Often it is the case that we are faced with the problem of describing speech sounds in terms of some of them have very restricted distribution, like sounds from loan phonology, borrowed vocabulary. Where do we place them? Do we consider a system as a single system or one made of multiple systems? And so on. After the discussion of the problems in phonemic analysis, we turn to the discussion of prosodic features. The main point that we noted was that the structural phonology was not very strong in the study of prosodic features. It, however, laid the foundations of the study of prosodic features, and this is one of the objectives of including these modules here, although the discussion of all these prosodic features is presented in much greater detail in the paper course on advanced phonology, because it is in later stages of generative phonology that these prosodic phenomena have come to be studied extensively. However, the foundations of these were laid in structural phonology, and that's how we have gone into discussing these, in especially the basic concepts which have given us some of these critical notions in prosodic phonology. So we looked at the syllable. The study of the syllable was mainly from the point of view of talking about phonotactics, which was of main interest in structural phonology. We also talked about juncture and stress, limited to the discussion of degrees and types of stress, and lexical tone. Again, you find that all of these are included in the IPA chart on prosodic suprasegmental features. And then finally, we talked about the two phenomena in prosodic phonology, one speech rhythm and the other intonation. In speech rhythm, we found that one of the very useful bases of distinguishing between the different phonological properties of languages is speech rhythm. A language such as English was considered to be stress-timed, and a language such as French or Hindi or Bangla was considered to be syllable-timed. This distinction, however, is not held so strongly today, but it was a useful one, and there are different ways of studying it afresh. The topic of rhythm is also closely connected to the topic of intonation. Actually, we tried to show that the two are quite intricately bound together. You cannot talk about intonation without talking about rhythm, and the study of rhythm is pointless unless we can relate it to intonation. The purpose is to be able to make sense of meaning which is dependent on these two phenomena. In the study of intonation, we went into details of the phonetics of intonation, the structure of intonation, and then the functions of intonation. We restricted ourselves to the description to the structuralist phonological model. And then it was considered necessary to introduce some of these basic concepts of generative phonology, because that is where that's the transition to the next course on advanced phonology. What we notice is that there is not a sudden break from in generative phonology from structural phonology. Actually, there is a smooth transition. And this is mainly to give you an idea about how there has been a continuation in our knowledge of phonology, phonological theory, from structural phonology to generative phonology. Although we have moved from structural phonology, but we still continue to use some of these basic notions and concepts, and they have not gone redundant or they have not been thrown away. They continue to be used. Generative phonology, however, is considered to be useful and now somewhat essential to the study of sounds from the point of view of the knowledge of speech sounds. Structural phonology is focused mainly on the description of speech sounds. With generative phonology, we came to have fresh goals of phonology along with generative grammar, which was not to describe languages, but to explain the knowledge of languages. So generative phonology is part of generative grammar in trying to look for ways and means of studying language as knowledge rather than as something, as a structure which is out there in society. We presented the modules of this on the screen. You see these two great figures who were behind the theory of generative phonology, Noam Chomsky and Maurice Haller. These two proposed the basic classic theory of generative phonology, and which has come to be revised and re-revised under their guidance. And this is one of the most interesting features of the development of the theory of generative phonology. Within generative phonology, we introduced you to the model of generative phonology and to the main concern of generative phonology in arriving at the issue of underlying representation. So we do not talk about phonemes in the structuralist sense. We talk about phonemes in the generative phonological sense of something which is underlying in and part of our knowledge of language. How do we arrive at the underlying forms is the main concern of classical generative phonology. In order to do that, we were shown that you look at the various interactions among phonological processes, then you form hypotheses about which of the processes is at work. For example, when you find in Hindi, for example, when you say tabla and you say tabalchi, you would like to know how do you account for presence of and absence of in the two forms, tabalchi where it's present, tabla where it is absent. Is it the case that is inserted, or is it the case that is deleted? Now this will decide the form of the underlying representation. So you propose these hypotheses and then you test them against the entire data of the language. This is one of the great gains of generative phonology. Apart from it, we came to have somewhat like a Copernican revolution in phonology with the introduction of distinctive features. I would like to emphasize that distinctive features were actually introduced in the period of structural linguistics itself in the late 50s, before generative grammar actually started. However, the theory has come to be grown, and we try to introduce you to the history of the development of distinctive features, and mainly to those features which are now in current use. With the once we are introduced to distinctive features, then we can easily see how the use of distinctive features helps us to arrive at simple grammars, and also helps us to explain the knowledge of the sound structure of languages. That has been the basis of this course, and we hope that you have enjoyed the course and that you are now ready to offer the course on advanced phonology. Thank you.